Jai Hind, everybody. I think our Thursday lectures are going to complete today shortly. And our guest speaker today is the second time he is been kind enough to come all the way from down south because of his passion on strategic issues. Last time he spoke to us on what do you call those smaller countries in the Pacific Island.
Pacific Oceania.
There is another term of those countries, mini. I'm not just. But this is a in Micronesia.
Micronesia, Micronesia, Polynesia.
Correct. So these were the three terms and the countries which were coming under that. That's what he had covered that time, and he had covered it both from his professional expertise and I think first-hand experience also having visited there, at least some of the countries. But today he'll be speaking to us on a very, very important subject. We are seeing that in the recent past, the changes, the rate of change, and how we can reflects challenge. It is easy to criticize a country as even if we are asked to see what exactly should be our approach in this particular situation, it will be probably difficult for us to get something in black and white. There will be options which may not be in consonance with our stated policy. There may be some new contours, and it is not that you adopt that change today and that continue for times to come. So the dynamics of change is phenomenal. It is not only that this strategy is going to impact the war fighting that in any case is going to impact. There are multiple reports that even a country like USA, they have already spent more than $11 billion, bulk of close to $5 billion of munition in the first 7 days. Besides their two fleets which were there, they have already mobilized their deployed Patriot missile systems and missile systems in South Korea to reinforce things there. So it's a huge challenge. In fact, when Russia and Ukraine war started, in a very, very short span of time, the entire world's munition was pulled off. And even in people were irrespective whether they were on the side of Russia or Ukraine, there were people, of the common interest whose interest remains primarily in business. So they were scouting on both sides, whose were countries there who can provide them some kind of munition, artillery cells, and things like that. So we are in a very, very difficult time, so to say. Besides the conventional strategic domain, I think the time has to look at the other aspects, whether it is economy. When I got a call from one of our relatives yesterday that the gas is going to be stopped. And he had given his to somebody else so that he was trying to put that. So there may be certain shortages, but maybe there may be certain social media apprehensions which happen in these kind of things. But it does indicate that we have to create capacities. Part of what statement has come from the central government that we have got 7 to 8 weeks worth of reserve oil, but gas is the lesser so they are trying to put their best in this situation. But if the fight continues for long duration, there will be a challenge. So the capacity creation in terms of every aspect of national resources, whether they are the war fighting tools, whether they are the munitions, whether there is manpower, whether there is the skill set, where there is storage capacities for the fuel or anything for that matter is required to be in a much bigger manner because the capacity creation takes time. And even a country who may be friendly with you today, I think I mentioned it one of these days that the intentions may change overnight, and then you don't know what to do about it. So I think, given his expertise and the way he's keeping a tab on the issues, he will bring out a lot of important issues, and he may help us to indicate kind of directions and the options which country has. And of course, it will be a good platform for us to interact with him. So format, what we are following is that she'll introduce you, then after it is all your show. And once that gets over, that time we will give the chance to the online students and the participants to interact with you. But all interactions, whether it is with online people or offline, is not recorded, so that it is more free and frank, exchange of ideas can take place. So, Ayos.
Thank you, sir. Balaji Chandramohan is a research scholar with the University of Madras and had taught strategic studies course at the university. He was previously a visiting fellow with Future Directions International, Perth, Australia. He has studied for his journalism course in New Zealand and has lived in the Pacific Islands such as Fiji. He has also worked as a journalist in New Zealand. Further, he has worked as a journalist with Lok Sabha TV, that is Cancer TV now, DD News, and AsiaNet International. He also worked as an Asia Pacific correspondent for World News Forecast and has contributed to the Asia Times. Also, he is an alumnus of Geneva Center for Security Policy, where he did a course on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Further, he also worked previously with MPIDSA, which included working on the project on India's grand strategy in 2011-12. He has taught international relations with Indian Academy of International Law. He also worked for Chennai Center for China Studies and had done research on Pacific Islands for the center. Further, he prepared a detailed report on China's strategic interest in the Pacific Islands and need for India's approach in the region for the Center for Contemporary China Studies. He also published extensively on India's strategic interest in the Pacific Islands and the Indo-Pacific. Further, he analyzed maritime security strategy document released in 2015 by the Indian Navy. His research interest includes intersection of doctrine and strategy. His research publications include work on India's grand strategy and on multi-domain operations as a part of his peer-reviewed publications. Also, he did a fellowship with Institute of Constitutional Parliamentary Studies on India's civil-military relations. Further, he was invited to do a course on weapons law and the conduct of the legal review of weapon course by GCSP in 2012, and leadership program conducted Upshire Anomaly Leadership Academy of the Center for Strategic and International Studies based in Washington, D.C. He is also a life member of CENJOWS, an associated member of think tanks such as USI, MPIDSA, and NMF. He has also published in journals such as Global Brief, New Zealand International of International Affairs, and Romanian Review. He has also given interviews in DD News, Radio New Zealand, Radio Australia, and Russian TV. Welcome, sir.
Ayos.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for CENJOWS. Thank you, sir, for inviting me to hear actually on India's grand strategy in practice. And I understand this is actually the most right place to talk about that, because the Integrated Defense Staff, which predominantly is a tri-service organization, happens to have released a joint doctrine in 2017, and it did talk about explicitly about India's grand strategy. So first of all, I would like to know, what today's topic is on India's grand strategy in practice. So what is actually, what do you mean by in practice? Not theory, but in practice. There's a lot of difference between this and that. So what is actually a strategy as such? What is grand strategy? First, let's get into the conceptual understanding of that. See, what is strategy? We all know, we are actually in a military institution. We all know what is tactics. Tactics is a theory of use of force for in a battlefield. That is tactics, simple thing. But what is strategy? Strategy is a use of force for objective of war. That is strategy. This is the Clausewitzian dictation. Then what is actually grand strategy? That's been the case. So something which is above strategy for is called as a grand strategy. So if you see the Clausewitzian notion, it says that it's actually a policy. Policy means policy in execution. There is another thing is called policy in theory. So theoretical understanding of grand strategy. So there's actually some distinction in that. The countries which does not being able to have an understanding of grand strategy or theoretical understanding of grand strategy, that doesn't mean that the country does not actually have a grand strategy or a policy perspective. Say, for example, in our own case, India's case, if you see that, I mean, like, if you see the country of the size of India, I mean, like, we are actually a very geographically pronounced country, and we are actually a growing economic country, okay? And we are actually the largest population in the world. But I was actually, surprised when I started to actually follow this topic on grand strategy, a strategy that was nearly about 10 to 15 years before, 15 years before, when giants on this field like Subramaniam, Kanti Bajpai, they were all there. And I actually even in fact conducted a research on India's grand strategy. They came out of the big in 2012. When they were actually talking about the concept of grand strategy, the first thing that comes to the mind is that India does not have a grand strategy as such. The notion is that there's a famous American social scientist called George Stanley, who came out with a report in 1992 on Red Corporation. He said that India does not have a strategy culture. And the reason what he said that because that we have been invaded by many countries and many times in our past, so that means that we don't have a strategy culture. But that's a very simplistic, what one could say, one-dimensional approach. What he did not know is that even in South India, we have the Cholas did have a maritime strategy, grand strategy of their own. And even the invasion that we actually study in our history, that's my understanding, is that the fact of the matter is that they have all been abbreviations. They have not been the rule. Whenever we have a very strong and foundational what one could institutions which have been there in place, it was being very difficult for the what one could say the invaders to come to India to invade. Even the Mongols, one of the greatest land invaders, they struggled to come to India and to invade them. That means the concept of strategy and strategic thinking was there very much in us. Even if you see Kautilya's Arthasastra, they talk about the Shadguna policy, then you talk about the Rajamandala theory. And Kautilya's Arthasastra, if you see the quotings which are there, so that means the concept of strategic thinking has been there very much embedded in our institutional thinking. But it has been somewhat what one would say blurred because there have been some abbreviations, there have been some discontinuity in the way in which that we are taught. But now at this time, I think at this juncture, we have actually a much more coherent approach when it comes to dealing with our own national security threat and assets. See, then we come back to the concept of grand strategy as such. So that means that we do have a strategic thinking. India does have a strategic thinking. India does have a strategic culture of its own, and also the concept of way of warfare. I mean, the Indian way of warfare is also there, which is actually a pronounced way of warfare. If you see that our own earlier texts like Ramayana, Mahabharata, it does talks about the concept of attritional warfare, which we are in place, and the concept of attritional warfare, which is being followed even till now. If you see that is completely different, if you see the maneuver warfare, which is there in the Central Asian countries, which is followed by the Central Asian countries. So that means that warfare is there, the strategic culture is there, and therefore the grand strategy is also there. The strategic understanding of the things are there. But the fact of the matter is, most of the people who actually see our own strategic thinking have been actually thinking from a Western angle or from the Chinese angle. So we do have an inherent strategic thinking of our own that is being practiced by in our own institutions. Maybe even the institutions which do have may have been coming from the Western institutions, but the way in which the people have worked on it, we do have a strategic thinking of our own. We do have the way in which that we have approached the problem. There is no doubt about that. So that has been the basic conceptual understanding that we need to develop. Now, coming back to the concept of grand strategy, which is being followed by other countries, you see that the Americans during the First World War or the Second World War, they did conduct themselves in a better way. I mean, if you see that the British, they did actually develop the concept of grand strategy, maritime strategy, which they did develop. And then if you see the countries which did not fail to develop the concept of grand strategy, for example, the Germans, for example, they did excel at the operational level of warfare. But when it comes to the achieving at the political success of warfare, they failed both at the First World and the Second World War. So that doesn't mean that the military effectiveness will alone only yield to you to benefit. But if you see the Bismarck, during the Bismarck time, the Germans were very excellent and good at the operational level, and they were able to make sure that they were able to get the political objectives of the war. So that happens to be the case. Then, if you see the Americans, whatever lesson they learned from the Second World War, they failed to develop during the Vietnam War. So then they actually reconciled that they need to be able to develop the political objectives of the war much more clearly, which will help them. And not when you develop the political objectives of the war, that has to be there an aspect of diplomacy. See, what is actually war is a continuation of politics by other means. That means war and diplomacy are part of the flip sides of the same coin. That happens to be the case. So in India's case, if you see, many people have questioned of how we have actually approached the kind of grand strategy as such, right? Starting from the independence or starting from the other point of view, my understanding is that we have been able to develop it in a much better way. The fact of the matter is, we have, unlike some of the Western countries, we have not come up with an explicit defense white paper or the national security strategy document, but we did come out with some of the doctrines which we have actually developed. Say, for example, the joint doctrine which came out in 2017, the maritime security strategy doctrine about in 2015, and the maritime strategy document which came out in 2007, which was actually an explicitly stated grand strategy, and which predominantly also came out with a classified force structures. And those actually documents helped out to develop the necessary force structure as such. So there is no doubt about that we do have what we would say the concept of grand strategy. The grand strategy is also, or the strategy culture is also an important thing. If you see it in a very simplified way, strategy culture, grand strategy is followed by force disposition, force concentration, and then what one could say the level in which the economy should be developed for the force. And then it's actually like a straightforward equation. So one thing follows the other one. If it's actually a lack of strategy culture, or what I would say the grand strategy, then it actually means the fact that the state is not able to develop effectively when it comes to the internal and the external security threat that we face. So that happens to be the case. But in India's case, we do have it. See, coming back to the fact that how we have actually developed, what one could say, at the present level, from the time in which that we got independence, we were actually in a very precarious state because we were actually threatening a constant threat from both our northern and western borders. But for that, it actually curtailed our ability to develop what one could say an effective maritime strategy of us. Also, say if you see the writings of K.M. Panikkar or K.S. Vaidya, who developed the maritime strategy, they advocated three-fleet, what one could say, three-fleet navy. But we could not develop the three-fleet navy basically because we were one was based in Maldives, another was based in Trigonomelee, another was based in Port Blair. This happens to be what one could say the English Mahanian option of what one could say the maritime strategy, which we are now talking about in the Indo-Pacific. But was it being able to materialize? That's not because we were much more focused. The government of the day was much more focused on protecting its own territory. So losing an inch of territory would have been much more disastrous for it. So in that case, the force structure was predominantly oriented towards dealing with our affecting what one could say Pakistan and of course with China. So till 1962, this was actually the way in which we have thought about that. So this and what one could say, apart from that, this is actually a military angle. But we see the political angle of that. We were actually caught up after the when we got independence. We were actually caught up in the end of the Cold War, start of the Cold War. And the Cold War was there when the Americans were when they did come out an NSC 68 document, and the Soviet Union was predominantly they focused in Europe. What was our position was? So we actually thought that non-alignment would have been the better position for us. The non-alignment means that is happens to be our grand strategy in practice. That happens to be our foreign policy in practice, which was actually criticized by others. We should have actually joined some military alliance. But in that case, that we were able to survive as a nation, basically because we actually thought of this is the best way to go about it. And the non-alignment did happen. Non-alignment did happen. And when it happened, we actually benefited out of that. We could actually mobilize the global south in support of us, which is actually a practice which is being held even now. If you see that G20 summit which is being held, or the India Pacific Alliance which has been held, or the India African Union has been held, or the way in which that we have dealt with the Latin American countries. The fact of the matter is that we have not explicitly joined a military alliances as such has actually benefited us. Even I can give you a very simple example. The free trade agreements that we have actually been able to develop with most of the European countries, that has been materialized because the European countries have understood that we did not actually explicitly form an alliance with the Soviet Union during the heydays of the Cold War. So, when it comes to what is happening today, it is also a matter of fact that what happened yesterday and what is going to happen tomorrow. In that case, what happens is that we did not fall on explicit alliances. That's very interesting. I also teach Kautilya, Sastra and everything. They say that one of the questions which was asked is why we did not have Kautilya predominantly talks about the concept of Mitra. So alliance, why did we not actually form a Mitra? Why could have easily gone into an alliance during the start of the independence? That would have happened. We would have actually been in a very precarious situation. Say, for example, we would have actually, even despite getting independent, it took us a long time for us to even to join the Commonwealth nation. The reason is basically because there was actually a domestic population in our country, which was actually there predominantly oriented toward communism. So we did not want to antagonize that particular thing, and we could have joined the communist bloc, and that would have actually also put us in precarious situation as such. So there was actually some kind of population which was actually against us joining it. It was actually joined within us. So we actually had a very balancing approach when it comes to our what one could say in way in which that we could actually deal with our own adversary. It is actually a case of buying time. The US concept of manifest destiny, the concept of non-alignment itself was something that the United States itself actually followed when they followed the independence. That was actually the policy in which that we adopted. But we were actually forced to join the what one would say US bloc starting from 62. In 62, we had to join, we had to go for the US help. I mean, like basically the problem happened because we were actually being threatened in our northern borders. And subsequently, what happened in 65, we were able to get the military victory, and we were able to get into political solutions. And that was actually popular because we had a right concept about that. Then the icing on the case was happening in 71. 71 war, even despite there was not been that much amount of credit that is being given to our, both to our military establishment or to a diplomatic school. The how, even despite the whole world was against us, but still we were able to get that military victory and we were able to secure the diplomatic success. That is basically because even the US and China were very much aligned against us. Most of the Western countries was against us. But still, with the support of the Soviet Union and the support in this that we could get mobilize our domestic population and the international forums, we were able to make sure that we have voice have been heard. And that actually, to a larger extent, if I could be a little bit more explicit, many of our neighbors, neighboring countries, including the SAARC countries, whom they look up to, what one could say, outside the scope of South Asia for their own identity, but they don't realize that India being as a stable power, India being as a stable power in international system has actually helped them to continue as a nation state. If you see actually like whether it is in Nepal or in Maldives or in Bangladesh or in Myanmar, even in Afghanistan for that, or in Sri Lanka, these countries have been able to have a continuity in their political system because India happens to be as a stable country. And not necessarily that. Even the United States, for that matter, United States itself, all the Western countries itself should actually be in a much more grateful position. If you would have been actually being held sway by an authoritarian system of governance, that would have actually curtailed their, what one could say, the sea lanes of communications in which they would have actually had towards the whole of Indo-Pacific during the heydays of Cold War. So we did adapt what one could say the security system of the Soviet Union, but we did have a political system of our own in which what one could say there could be a much more continuity towards our own population. That aspect has not been appreciated much more in the international system, but we do have it. I was also actually surprised when it comes to the concept of grand strategy, the diplomacy, and everything. I actually happened to come across a person called Srinivasa Sastry. And he is actually, there's a new book which actually talks about he is actually the India's first diplomat. First diplomat in a sense, like from the time of the First World War till the time of the Second World War, India was pushed into various diplomatic deliverance which was there. And Srinivasa Sastry, being appointed by the British government, was able to understand that for a stable country like India to continue as a stable country, the more the international system is stable, it is actually much more inclusive. That happens to work in India's favor, and in vice versa. The more the stable the country in India as a military power, as an economic power, as a diplomatic power, that will actually also help the international system to be stable, which will be there beneficial to all the countries. That thought process was very much there. So in that case, if you see that after 62, after 71, we were actually much more started to align with the United States basically during the 1980s, basically because the Soviet Union was about to get disintegrated. Even when the Soviet Union was disintegrated, we did actually because the China was rising as a major power, and United States was looking for a country like India to balance China's options in the wider Asia Pacific system or the Indo Pacific system. In that case, what happened was that we did join with the United States. We did join with the United States. It's not actually an explicit part of our own strategic alliance. We were not involved in any strategic alliance except for with the Soviet Union briefly in 1971. But the fact of the matter is, we continue to develop what one could say the strategic partnerships, the minilateral agreements or the multilateral agreements which were there in place, with the United States starting as a umbrella, even despite the Washington being occupied by either the Democrats or the Republicans. We did continue to actually have an explicit strategic alliances with many of the countries, starting with Australia, even despite with, for example, Australia is a major pawn in the Pacific. The Australian government did actually what one could say was against us, what one could say, when we did test the nuclear weapons. Many of the, even the army officers who were attending the course were actually asked to leave the, what one could say, because we thought like we are actually going against their interests. But today, Australia itself is actually buying what one could say nuclear submarines to protect itself. So in that case, and it is actually advocating it on the whole AUKUS system which is there in place. That was actually a part of their way in which to develop the nuclear deterrence against China. And when it comes to developing the nuclear deterrence against China, it is also the fact that it is ready to have a kind of a strategic alliance with the country like India when it needs to develop its own nuclear deterrence. There's no doubt about it. When you talk to the Australian officers or Australian specialists, they actually very much are focused on that. But the question to be asked is whether we actually they are seeing India as a counterweight to China. whether the fact of the matter is that they see actually what one could say, they see for themselves their own security interest, and they see India as a balancing power towards China. So there's actually subtle differences in that. If you see that option, which is something which I would actually like to say, even despite in the post Sindhu, one of the diplomatic things that we actually saw it, many of the Quad countries, we did have what one could say the concept of Quad was very much there. The concept of Quad to actually, if not explicitly stated, to contain China in the whole of the Indo-Pacific was mooted. But the fact of the matter is, how many of these countries were actually ready to help us when it comes to dealing with Pakistan? That was actually a question which was raised. Why did they actually kick it? The answer is, it needs to be understood this, that when you actually talk about the concept of grand strategy or the foreign policy or the national security strategy that we are actually talking about, there's some differences in the way in which that we think about our own interests and they think about their own interests. They see India as a counterweight to China. They don't see India to be in a position to what we are, and they are ready to support that. So that happens to be the case. So when it comes to the international system as such, if you see that starting from the post-Sindhu and a lot of conflicts that we are actually hearing, starting from the Cambodia to Thailand to uh, Iran-Israel war and the US operations in Israel, one thing is very much clear. Nation states are being urged to protect their own self-interest. There's no doubt about that. And it is actually a self-helping system in the international system. The more you are able to self-help yourself, the better you will be in a position to be helped by others. So that happens to be the case. So that understanding that we are actually starting to understand it. So that experience of post-Sindhu was one of the things that we have understood. And that was actually very interesting. If you see that when it comes to our own operations before Sindhu in Doklam and Galwan Valley, we were able to make sure that if, for example, some of the surveillance systems that we actually did have, the Americans tend to say that, we did also help you in providing some of the inputs during the Doklam uh, uh, operations, and we did actually also help you in the surveillance in the post-Dian. But how much of the validity has been there? That has been a question. If you see the concept which goes back to the 1962 war during China, the fact of the matter is that after what one could say 1962, if you see that Nehru's correspondence with Kennedy, it predominantly talks about the fact that when it comes to what one could say Chinese operations, we were actually frantically asking for American help in 1962. No, basically because that was a situation in which that we were. I mean, if you see the correspondence, but the fact of the matter is that the Americans were ready to help us, whatever help they did. Actually, that is to be a questionable thing. The fact of the matter is they were able to help only after the operations. So that happens to be the case. If you see to the Russians, they always see that the Americans help to the India's strategic thinking, or Americans help to India's strategy itself is very minimal. But if you see the Russians' importance when it comes to the India's strategic approach, you see the way in which they have helped us in developing our own submarines or nuclear submarines, or in which that they have been able to develop our own data shield during the Operation Sindhu, and also during the Sukhoi, the BrahMos system. All this kind of system, the Russians were able to help, and they also have a reason for it. There's a more important reason. When you talk to the Russians, they say that why we are actually helping why you are ready to help India. That's like saying that we are actually a major pivot country in the whole of the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific country, which they see as a pivot. It is not necessarily the US see as a pivot. The fact of the matter is that the Russians are also ready to see as a pivot. And the fact of the matter is, when it comes to the Russian seas as a pivot is an important aspect to contain both the Western countries and also China. So in that case, they are ready to help us. Now, we do have our differences, say, for example, with the Russians also. For example, when it comes to our policy in Central Asia or even in the Middle East, we do have our own differences. It is true the fact that we actually were very much helpful. The Russians were very much grateful for us to have more diplomatic presence in Central Asia. If you see that India Central Asia Summit, which was actually started in 2022, it was held. Then subsequently, actually, also we were actually much more focusing more on Central Asia, which is a part of our immediate neighborhood. We also understand the fact that the concept of, Central Asia happens to have, events in Central Asia happens to have repercussion in Middle East, and happenings in Middle East do have what we would say repercussions in Central Asia. In that case, what happens is that when we have a much more favorable disposition towards Russia, that will help us, what one could say, to curtail China's operations in Central Asia, which will help us to get the necessary energy passage from there, which we are actually facing as a shortage now, and also from the Middle East. If you see the TAPI project and also the other projects which are road connectivity, which is there from Central Asia, that is very much could be facilitated if we have better relations with Russia. But also we have some differences. Say, for example, the oil base which we have in Tajikistan, that was actually our external base which was there. And we have not been able to upgrade our facilities there, which may be upgraded in the future. But other countries also, this is one of the problems of when you actually have a grand strategy, when you actually have an ambition as a strategy as such, you would be actually forced to actually also acquire what one could say the necessary external basis. For example, we were actually, that was an issue which we had with Maldives. That was an issue which we had with Mauritius. That was an issue which we had in Sri Lanka in the 1980s. Maybe this is an issue which we might be having. But the fact of the matter is that at the external basis, India's need for external basis or India's need for positioning its troops as a signal of power is an important aspect. Now, if you see that Maritime Security Strategy document, which came out in 2015, and also the subsequent Joint Warfare Doctrine, which came out in 2017, it predominantly talks about India's grand strategy in a much more explicit way. What it actually talks about the 2015 document, which was actually one of the most what one could say appreciated aspects of India's grand strategy. What it says is that India's interest is predominantly in the Indo-Pacific. So when you talk about the concept of Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, from where it starts, where it ends, it starts from the Gulf region and ends till Australia. This happens to be the area in which our political, military, diplomatic orientation will be there. In that case, how we will be able to develop the force structures for that, and how we will be able to develop the kind of concept, what kind of military thinking, maritime military thinking, that was much more explicitly stated. If you see the other doctrines which came out in place, say for example, the limited warfare doctrine which came out in 2004, or the Air Force doctrine which came before that, but that did not actually predominantly talk about the grand strategy in a much more explicit way. The maritime strategy, in consultation with many of the stakeholders, it did come out in a much more explicit way. It predominantly talks about the fact also, though they did not actually talk about what constitutes the force concentration which we need to develop. It is also a true to the fact that it did talk about much more in an explicit way of how we could actually achieve a kind of a great power status. That was in 2015, 2016. It predominantly talks that India's, what one could say, India's interest lies in the Indo-Pacific region, starting from the West Asia till what one could say the Australia. So in that case, we would be able to develop the what one could say an important aspect of our maritime strategic thinking or the grand strategic thinking is the need for us to keep the sea lanes of communications open. So when we actually have a what one could say the issue which we are now facing, say for example the gas issue or the other national issues, the fact of the matter is the more we keep the sea lanes of the communications open, the more we are actually what one could say being able to keep the disruptive powers outside, then that would actually help us our own population. This is actually a vice versa thing. One is actually for an explicit military reason, another one is for a very civilian reason that we need to protect our own population. That happens to be the case. If you want to keep the sea lanes of communications open, that predominantly gets us to the concept of the sea control aspect. Sea control or the what one could say that one requires a Gorbachev kind of thinking or the Mahanian kind of thinking, and also the fact that it is not necessarily then we develop the structures for that. If we activate the sea control, then we need how many aircraft carriers that we need. Then how many aircraft carriers that we need, then it also talks about the fact that is in the region. Say, for example, in a very explicitly way, if I could actually name it China. China's ambition is not actually not much more talked about in recent times, basically because we actually tend to talk about more about the happenings in the Middle East. But we do have what one could say a perennial threat from China. There is no doubt about that. If you see the fact of the matter is that the Chinese, the Chinese president and the relationship that they have with the senior military officers, which predominantly talks about a much more assertive what one could take China. That has been much more noticed by the United States. It was noticed by the United States much more during the Obama administration and the second George Bush administration. But now, because of the interest have been diverted in the present US administration, that has not been much more talked about. But it is true that the fact that Chinese ambitions coincide with our own national interest, which was actually explicitly seen during the Doklam and the Galwan Valley, because we were actually even before that we did have some diplomatic niceties with the Chinese president in Mahabalipuram, but it actually showed that their intentions are completely different with the Galwan Valley. So that predominantly talks about the way in which they have actually seen us, or they are actually going to see our own what one could say our own immediate neighborhood. In that case, That happens to be the way in which that we need to say. When it comes to actually, when we talk about the concept of grand strategy or the foreign policy that we are having, an important aspect of that is that to identify the core and the periphery. What is our core threat? Core security threat happens to be both from China and Pakistan in our northern borders. The peripheral approach that we are having is what with which that the Chinese are able to assert themselves in many of the island countries around us. There is no doubt about that they are going to do that. In that case, the maritime strategy, coming back to the concept of maritime strategy document, is predominantly talks about the force structure which we need to develop. That predominantly means both the submarines, conventional submarines, and also the nuclear submarines, which are there, both the SSNs and SSBs. Now, if you see the way in which that we have actually come up with two what one could say SSBs, and we are going to actually have even more. And also, this is one about the S4 kind of submarine that we are actually going to have the S5 kind of submarines, nuclear submarines for effective nuclear defense. And effective nuclear defense is against China. There's no doubt about that. And also to signal to our own partner, our own neighbor in Pakistan, that we do have the credible kind of deterrence. Now, that predominantly comes up to the question of the concept of no first use policy. If you see that, if you see many of the theories of international relations and strategic studies, which predominantly originated in the Western countries, but many of the theories have not been able to have a practical approachable in our own way, in Indian way. But one thing which we actually were able to develop was the concept of the nuclear deterrence. If you see the draft nuclear doctrine, which came up by the National Security Advisory Council Board in 1999, which predominantly talks about the concept of nuclear deterrence and no first use policy and the minimum credible difference. So these three happens to be our own tenets. If you see that has actually yielded any benefits, the answer is exactly yes. We see the way in which our neighbors have not been able to take chances. See, deterrence is predominantly a mind game. If you, as long as they feel that they don't want to take chances, that has been the case. Pakistan has been able to curtail its operations. We see the way in which that whatever claims that the U.S. presidency is making. It is true to the fact that the Pakistans have been pushed to the wall during the Operation Sindhu. And if they would have continued the operations, if they would have actually continued their operations, then that would have actually not helped their cause because they know the repercussions for that. And also, when the whole world was actually talking about pivot and the whole world was actually talking about what one would say, the way in which that we were actually going to deal with China during the Indo-Pacific, when we talk about Trump's but the first time when Trump was the president, even the Joe Biden administration, we did actually push the Chinese to the wall, the Doklam operation and also the Galvan Valley operations. So that was actually against India. So even many of the countries of the Indo-Pacific or the Pacific were actually wary of actually the Chinese threat when they were actually seeing that. They were actually pushed to the back, both in these operations. So in that case, our own national strategy, our own approach has been much more flexible, it has been much more dynamic, and it has been much more fruitful. Whenever we need to form what one could say an alliance, we have been able to do that. And whenever we have been pushed to the wall, we have been able to find other ways in which that we could do that. And we have actually, that is what actually predominantly talks about the Nehru's concept, whether starting from 1947 until this day, we do have what one could say the concept of strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy in which that we actually have our own interests first in place, and we do choose our partners, and we don't choose our enemies, we don't choose our neighbors, but we do choose our partners who are actually in a like-minded way. And the fact of the matter is, when we choose about a system, we also choose about a system in which that we could actually have a stable international system. That concept has been very much a part and which that we have actually thought about our own national security strategy. And the government of the day, whether it is actually, we are actually a democratic country, it is answerable to the people of this country for whatever they do. And we do have what one could say the means and the mechanism, the institutions which are there in place. We do have an answer to the people of this country. In that way, our what one could say the system is much more open, it's much more inclusive, and it is much more also much more a free and open society. Unlike, for example, in China, you see the purges which happening in China. What are called the PLA top brass have been, and most of them have worked with Xi Jinping. They have been associated, but they have been actually been removed from their post. The reason is predominantly basically because there have been no answers to them. There could be some personal reasons for that. But in our system, it's much more an open society. It's an open way in which that we do conduct our own what called military affairs, also the political affairs, and we do have a much more efficient coherent national security strategy. Yes, it is true to the fact that we have not explicitly come out with what one could say a national security strategy document, but the doctrines which have been come out for the of course, by the tri-service organization like IDS, and also by the individual services, they do predominantly talks about the fact in which that we need to conduct our own diplomatic, or one could say the military affairs in that way. So this happens to be the broad picture in which that we do actually happen have an understanding of grand strategy. But also an understanding of grand strategy also comes up with another issue, that how we are going to cooperate with other countries. We do actually, as I said, we do actually what one could say have an explicit strategic alliances with any of the countries. We do choose a path of forming unilateral or multilateral alliances. Say, for example, when we actually joined the Quad in 2007, and when the Quad was upgraded in 2016, it was very interesting. Trump does not talk about Quad anymore. The US does not talk about the Quad anymore. But it was with the most talked about the thing. The reason why the Quad is not talked about now is actually a reason that we have to know, because US interest is in Europe. It is linked to the Russian-Ukraine war. So everything happens to they themselves happens to derive from what one could say the happenings. So this is what actually the understanding of us. If you see that, if you see when the US entered the Second World War, it was actually the truth that the Japanese actually attacked them. It's also clear that the most of the military resources were actually allocated for Europe, not for this Asia. So this actually is something is an evidence, because the what I could say, even the whole concept of NATO, what I could say, the whole concept of containment was predominantly focused on Europe. Why Europe? Because Europe is the center of the world, was the center of the world, and is the center of the world. So the happenings in Europe will have much more bearings towards the United States and to the rest of the world. And of course, they tend to think that Indo-Pacific is predominantly in their periphery. But for us, both what happens in our own northern and western borders, and also in our own periphery, what if we could actually use it, where the maritime strategy has its influence. Say, for example, if we are actually having a good relations with France, when it acquiring, when it comes to acquiring their own military assets, like refer. But also France is an important player, what one could say, in scheme of things in the Indo-Pacific. It has got its military assets in many of the Indian Ocean, or also in the Pacific Ocean, and we do have the logistics agreement with the France. That means both them and we could use their military assets. So that happens to be the case. So this is completely in contrast to the kind of the world in which that when we got independence, when we actually thought about the Western world, or the Western world thought about us. It is completely a different world. It's completely a dynamic world in which we are talking about. So coming back to the concept of Quad, Quad was not an explicit military alliance, it is stated, but it actually signaling a military posture towards China. It actually talked about curtailing China in both the first island chain and second island chain and the third island chain, which happens to coincide in the way in which we need to keep the sea lanes of communications open. In that case, if you see that not necessarily that China is there, the countries which are the Quad were there, the other countries were there. Say, for example, if it's in Indonesia or France or even New Zealand for that matter. These countries are very much predominantly a part of the Quad. For example, if you talk about an Indo-Pacific thing, Australia does have what one could say a 5-point defense agreement, which they have, and they do have the what one could say some of the troops stationed in Singapore, because they knew that they were actually when they were having a conflict with Malaysia and Indonesia, they were against Indonesia. So in that way, they were actually questioning the troops in Malaysia. It is interesting during the 65 war, when the Australians and Indonesians happens to have some kind of differences among them, but they did actually were on the same page, basically because Indonesia was against us. Both Indonesia and Australia was against us. Both of them were against us during the 65 and 61 war. But they did have differences of themselves. So that happens to be an interesting kind of play. So when it comes to the way in which that we need to conduct our grand strategy or strategy in place, there are much more subtle nuances when it comes to dealing with our own foreign policy. We could actually, in another hand side, there has been a lot of talk when we talk about the strategic thinking and everything. We do tend to think about our own, what one could say, internal force structure which we are having, which we need to develop, which we'll be developing in the future. But there's also a way in which that we need to understand some of the subtle nuances in which the things are. Hey, for example, I could actually say during the heydays of the non-alignment, actually give an example of our own brand strategy or the foreign policy, some kind of dichotomous approach. We did actually, what I could say, have a very, the image that we had during the non-alignment world was that we are actually a peace-loving country and we did follow the non-alignment policy. But some of the African countries, when they were actually being colonized, some of the Portuguese countries in Africa, when they were being colonized, they were actually the brutal approach in this that colonial countries did have over the African countries. then they asked India for help, and India was ready to help these countries. The answer which we said was our policy of non-alignment was only for those countries which are actually having a rule of law for themselves. So, for example, it is Britain. But those countries which don't have a rule of law, for example, some of the Portuguese countries, we cannot actually, what I would say, support that kind of approach. So that we are able to help them in that way. But Chinese were much more, what I would say, much more smarter in that way. I mean, they were actually ready to help them even with the weapons. And that is one of the reasons why many of the African countries, many of the Latin American countries, do look up to many of the African countries, especially, they went to look up to China basically because they helped them to develop the kind of the revolutionary movement which they need to be there. So, because of their own linkage, especially with the Soviet Union at that time, and when they had differences with the Soviet Union, they did join the Americans in that way. So, when it comes to our own thinking, strategic thinking, we need to borrow something much more from the Kautilya Satyasastra, or when it comes to Chinese approach towards politics or the international system, is that we need to be a little bit more, what would say, ruthless. The Chinese were very much ruthless. If you see that how they actually approached their own strategy itself, they very much actually supported the Soviet Union till 1961. Right? But when even they fought against the Americans during the Korean War, but the moment they were ready to join with the, what I would say, ready to join with the United States, in the later part of the Cold War, I mean, especially to thwart Soviet Union. So that happens to be the big difference in the way in which that they approach that issue. Even despite both of them having to be, what I would say, the concept of communism was there both in China and Soviet Union. Though you can say it's a different approach, they were able to do that. And the moment it is also a very smarter way. The moment, what I would say, when it comes to the end of the Cold War, towards the end of the Cold War, when the Americans were emerging as a major power, they were ready to challenge them again. But with the help of the technology that was provided by the Soviet Union, because many of the Soviet Union engineers or the scientists who are actually developing the kind of weapon system, they were ready to actually, what can say, make them to work in China. And that was one of the major factors in which the China was able to develop their arm productions in much better way. So that happens to be the same. When it comes to the one in which that we see things in our own neighborhood, we see things in the world, we need to also be a little bit more. Astuteness happens to be an important aspect of grand strategy. I mean, how we are able to grab the situations. And in the last 10 years, I mean, when you talk about today's topic is about the grand strategy in practice. And if you see that, the grand strategy in practice happens to be much more astute. For example, I could give you an example. I was there in 2014 in Fiji when our prime minister visited there, and we actually also had the Chinese president visiting Fiji. Both the things were happening at the same place, and our own diplomatic approach towards that first Pacific Island forums was much more pronounced. The fact of the matter is that we could actually bring the prime ministers of all the Pacific Island countries to come and meet our own prime minister. That was a big difference. The reason was basically because they were able to attract us. I mean, like we were able to attract them. That was actually a big issue. I mean, that was actually a big game changer in the way in which that we have approached the thing. And coming back to the concept of the Indo-African Forum. Indo-African Forum started in 2008. It was actually one of the way in which it was actually ebbing and flowing. But the Chinese were able to bring the 53 head of states of the African countries in one time. And our diplomatic, diplomatic institutions are very more average. So is it possible for us to bring all these head of states in one single number? That was a question, but that was answered. Because when subsequently when we did conduct the what was the India African Summit, or the fact of the matter that the G20 summit that we have been able to have. So that happens to be the way in which that we have been able to. So this happens to be the general picture in which that we have been able to conduct our own national security policy or the foreign policy in a much more a pronounced way. So that's a difference. And I would say that whether when it comes to rearranging our own force structure for theater command, that will be something a topic to discuss in the future. And also in which that we actually also see the world through our own what I could say diplomatic or the military projection in which that we could be able to do that. That happens to be in a much more pronounced way, and that happens in a way much more nuanced way. In a more an aggressive way, also we have been able to develop. So that happens to be a change in this that we have been able to develop. But coming back to all these four things, so why, how, when we talk about the whole of grand strategy and everything, how do we see ourselves in international system as a country? So we also know that the fact that we are actually looking for an opportunity to become the permanent member of the UN Security Council. We also look for a position in the NPT as a nuclear weapon state. That happens to be. So this will actually add up to our own issues. But it's also an important aspect. All these things happens to be actually when it comes to the concept of theoretical understanding in which that India happens to be having its grand strategy. Whether it will be actually a kind of a liberal international system that we are going to be a part of it, or a kind of an approach in which that we will be forced to be in a kind of a balance of power system. So that happens to be the system. It is to the fact that the balance of power or the containment strategy against a major power will be a part of the system. There is no doubt about it. But it's also that is a realistic or a realistic way in which the international system, moral politic way in which the international system is being done. But it is also the fact that we do, because of our own, the way in which our population is, the way in which we see our own democratic system. It's also true that we will be actually acquiring a liberal, much more liberal approach to the national system that will predominantly solve many of the problems when we see our own neighborhood. If you see that many other countries look up to India, say for example, our Prime Minister visiting Maldives, we were actually having some issues with the Maldives a year ago. But now, if you see that the kind of accordance that was given to the Prime Minister, it's pretty much just a small example that I'm giving. So that is because of the fact that we do stand for something of a moral value in our own approach to foreign policy or diplomacy. There's no doubt about that. And that has been the reason. And they are also grateful for the fact that we are able to send the military in 1988, what was an important acknowledgement of our own thing. And also, even for the example in Bangladesh, in fact, even it is also the fact that though the Bangladesh, one of our more, we do have some differences in the way in which that they conduct their affairs, the government of the affairs, but it is also true the fact that the Bangladesh as a country, as a sovereign country, is being established because of us. And as I said, many of the countries in our own neighborhood do have a continuity in their political system as a part of their government approach is predominantly because of. So that happens to be the case. So we do have what I would say the Rajamandala theory that we heard or talked about during the Portfolio system or the present system, the institution, when it comes to approaching our own diplomacy towards SARC or Quad or BIMSTEC or with the United Nations, African Union, Pacific Islands Forum, even with the way in which that we see ourselves with the European Union or with the Caribbean countries or with the Latin American countries, we do have a way in which our approach is completely different. It's much more nuanced, and we do support a much more stable system in which that both the world and our own population will benefit. That happens to be the crust of which that our grand strategy is being placed. That has been the grand strategy for what I would say a policy approach as a foreign policy and national security. It's also the truth that when it comes to arranging our own internal, because when we actually talk about what I would say as a country, who will listen to us? If they will only listen to us when you can actually have a soft power. But the fact of the matter is that we do have actually a necessary hard power. The hard power is that our own military. The more we see, it is also the truth. The fact that strategy and security can be always a political but also a military thing. Only the more that you have a military, the more the capability, if you have a military, then you will be listened in the world. There's no doubt about it. United States did understand it during the Second World War. The more they were able to develop that necessary military industrial complex, the more it will be benefited for them. That was the way in which they were listened. Otherwise, nobody would have listened to them. And that was actually the difference from the way in which the days of League of Nations was done and to the United Nations, because the whole world was looking to the United States to actually, what one could say, thwart the authoritarian regimes. So in that way, they were here. That's right. Their values were here, their approach was here, the democratic systems were here, everything was here. Subsequently, in India's case also, the more we develop the hard power projection, the more we are able to develop the kind of hard power internally and which we be able to develop externally, that will be in a way in which we see the other thing. And as I always remember, I mean, like when I actually started following this policy, grand strategy concepts 10 or 10 years ago, the important aspect is what is strategy? Strategy is not telling to others what we are going to do, that is strategy. And also the fact that our best days are the future. And we all see that our own way in which that our best days in the future, we are all in a position to develop the necessary kind of intellectual capacity to make sure that we are actually on the right track. That has been the case.